Here we are in the new tun room at Ardmore. Ardmore, we have 10 45,000 litre washbacks, and we have 4 90,000 litre washbacks, of which this is one. Now, as you can see, these are made from wood. These are Douglas fir, which actually comes from Canada. And the reason we use wood here at Ardmore is because of the impact it has on flavour. We firmly believe in getting as much flavour into our fermentations as we possibly can. Because let's face it, in the still house, all we're going to do is distill. We're going to remove unwanted flavours. And by law, the flavours in our final spirit must be indicative of the flavours created here during the fermentation process. If you can imagine that new make spirit, it comes off our stills at 68% alcohol. The remainder is water, forget about that. Of that 68% alcohol, approximately 67.8% is ethyl alcohol, ethanol, vodka, flavourless, tasteless. It's 0.2%, which are the flavour congeners, which provide all the spirit that we want to get into the bottle. Now, when you're dealing with such little quantities as 0.2%, it's vitally important we get as much flavour in as we can. 4 main ways of getting flavour into the fermentation, and that is obviously your malt. Ardmore has a peated malt, so fundamentally we're different. The other 3 methods are in here. The first one, the metabolic reaction of the yeast as it feeds on the sugar, creates chemical compounds. The second one is to the yeast. As the yeast starts to break down, the cell walls will create flavour compounds. Towards the end of the fermentation also, as it starts to go anaerobic, as oxygen is all used up, more flavours, esters will be created. And the fourth and critical one, and I better whisper this one, is microbial infection. Microbial infection, my God, it sounds like we're going to kill folk. No, we're not. What makes good beer? What makes good cheese? What makes good yogurt? What makes great whiskey? A little bit of microbial infection. We steam these bags. We hard jet them with hot water. They're clean. They might not be 100% sterile though, but we don't want it that way. There'll be a culture in these washbacks which is indigenous to this washback, to this tun room and to this distillery, and we'll add flavour after flavour through the fermentations year after year. That's what we're trying to achieve, is consistency and maximising the flavour. Now, our mash tun is a traditional mash tun. She's cast iron. The plates are quite open and worn, and that means we get quite a cloudy wort here at Ardmore. And that cloudy wort is what we're looking for. We're not looking to get quite so much of the high fruity flavours. We want more of the robust cereal sweetness and that phenolic peaty tang in at the background. And that's what we get after our 55-hour fermentation. Now, this is still quite a young fermentation. It's only 20 hours in, so it's not achieved the maximum temperature yet. It will get up to about 33.5 degrees because it's an exothermic reaction. And basically what's happening is the yeast is feeding on the sugar. It's creating CO2, which we remove from the washback, and the byproduct effectively is the alcohol. And that alcohol level after 55 hours here at Ardmore will typically be in the region of about 8.6, 8.7%. So it's quite a potent brew. At the moment though, this is still probably about 70% sugar. So we can smell the sweetness, we can smell the peatiness in the nose. But already we can start to taste some of that flavour formation. We're starting to get the astringent flavours, the dry fruits, and that's what's going to come through. When you drink an Ardmore, you get the sweetness, you get the smoke, and you get the spicy fruit. And it's already starting to develop.
Here at Auchintosh we have 4 Oregon pine washbacks. A lot of people ask us, why do you use Oregon pine? Why not Scots pine? We've got lots of Douglas fir trees. Indeed, just across the road at the foot of the Kilpatrick Fells, we actually have some Douglas fir. There's a difference. If you go to Oregon and you look at the pine tree, it could be 200 feet in height with only foliage on the top, maybe a couple of meters. Because there, it's coming from the valleys, it's driving up into the sky because it wants to get to the sunlight. In Scotland, we don't have such steep gullies and valleys where our forests are. What you'll find in Scotland, though, is that we're much more subjected to the wind than Oregon is. So you will find that our pine trees have branches and foliage coming out from very low down the tree. Where you get a branch, you would get a knot in the wood. If you expose that to liquid over a period of time, it will split. What's most important is that we're using this to put a product into the human food chain. There can be no adhesives, no grouts, no treatments on the inside of the wood. It's entirely natural. I also think that that's part of the unique process and unique flavours that we find in Auchentoshan Spirit. Because remember, wood is porous. Where it's porous, it will hang on to some of the bacteria from the yeast. When we bring in our sugary wort here, and then we add yeast, the fermentation temperature will come up typically to about 33 to 34 degrees Celsius. But you've got that bacteria consuming all that sugar and turning it into alcohol. The byproduct of that, a small percentage of carbon dioxide. But more importantly, this porous wood hangs on to some of the good bacteria, and that will give you some of that real citrusy note that you get and is instantly identifiable again as Auchentoshan Spirit. Now, typically fermentation times can fluctuate depending on the temperature outside. Obviously, fermentation times can come down in the winter because it's cold outside. That lower ambient temperature encourages the yeast to die off slightly quicker. Now, in wooden washbacks, the yeast does die off slightly slower because it has that pore in the wood and things like that. If you see a metal washback, it will die quite quickly. Typically here at Auchentoshan, it can be anything from about 48 to 55 hours for the fermentation to come out. Especially in the summer where it gets a little bit warmer, it can take, closer to the 55 hours. But in the winter, we can have that down closer to 50 hours, 48 to 50 hours, just depending on how cold it is outside. Because remember, this is a natural process. We don't heat, we don't cool, everything is natural. Very important that Scotch whisky really can only be made from 3 key ingredients: malted barley, yeast and water, and then it comes down to Mother Nature and the effect that Mother Nature has on your final product. Now, one of the characters that you will notice in Auchentoshan Spirit, in all Auchentoshan Spirit, is a slight nuttiness. Now, our fermentation, we're pumping slightly earlier than most distilleries. If we were to leave this for 60, 70, 80, 90 hours, as you could do, it would become a lot more sour in terms of its character, a lot more acidic, and you get a lot more of the estery flavours coming out. But remember, here at Auchentoshan, we triple distill. So those extra lactic bacteria and things like that would be produced during this extra hours of fermentation or souring of the mash, we would actually remove these because we're taking a much smaller spirit cut. So that's why at Auchentoshan, really as soon as the washback dies, anywhere between 48 and 55 hours, we are good to pump to the still. And we've just pumped half of this washback through to the still. Now, in the washbacks, you can get an indication of what your final flavour is going to be. If you bring up the gaseous components there, you get real fruitiness, almost like something like apple core, something like that. A little bit of sweetness in there as well. We still have some sugar in here working out as well. In terms of the best hangover cure in the world, they refer to this as pundy. It's 7.5% alcohol. It's got all the yeast in there, it's milky, and certainly some of the old stillmen used to swear that this was the best cure for a hangover in the world. Personally, for me, I'm not so sure. I think when you've got an upset stomach, if you put that much bacteria into it, it could have a slightly different effect. Either cure you or kill you.
So we've now arrived at the fermentation vessels that we call washbacks. These particular ones are made from Oregon pine, but to be honest, the material of construction is a lot less important than the length of fermentation. So what we do is we take this sugary wort. It's come from the mash tun, it's been cooled, yeast has been added, and it starts to ferment. Now, if we were only interested in alcohol, we would stop the fermentation after about 45, 50 hours, and we would distill it. But that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in flavour. So we at Cardew ferment for 75 hours. And it's only with that longer fermentation that these sort of floral, grassy characters are produced much later in fermentation. If we look at our sister distillery again at Nakando, it's only a couple of minutes down the road. They use very similar malt, but they use a different mashing technique to create a cloudy wort. They then use a much shorter fermentation time, and combined, those things drive the flavour towards nutty, kind of spicy flavours. So already we can see by varying the processes in what are, comparatively small ways, we've started to, put real difference between the characters. In terms of distilling, fermentation actually plays an incredibly important part, because depending on the length of that fermentation is really the kind of starting point for the character production. If we have a short fermentation time, we're tending to set itself up for nutty. If we have a medium long, we're talking about grassy floral. If we go up maybe beyond 80 hours, we're starting to get into the real fruity characters that we associate with some of the Speyside malts. It's interesting when you first come into the kind of fermentation room and you get all these different smells and aromas, because when the washback is just filled and the yeast has been added, you get these lovely sort of yeasty, biscuity smells. As it progresses and you get to sort of medium fermentation, you're getting some of that kind of nutty character. Later on, the ester production is really starting to take hold, and you're getting some floral, fruity, apple, pear aromas. And then if it was allowed to go much further, we'd get some really strong sort of maybe green banana type flavours.